Hello and welcome to the Keep Learning podcast. My name is Alicja Syska.
And I'm Matthew Mesley.
And today we're talking about feedback.
Ooh, that's a juicy subject.
Juicy, yeah, juicy. Okay, juicy. That's a good start. Is that your most immediate association with the word feedback?
I don't know why I actually use that word, but I think it's an important one. Important topic. It's I suppose what I associate. I've got quite a positive, or I have positive associations with feedback. I'm quite strange, I suppose, in that way, in that I quite like receiving feedback for work that I've done. I always used to do that when I was a student. I used to really look forward to sort of reading my tutors or lecturers' comments. And seeing what they liked, but also what they thought I could sort of push more or how I could improve for the future. How about you?
Matthew, I think you would be a fantastic manager or entrepreneur, because I think management experts and entrepreneurs, they often say that feedback is the breakfast of champions. Or that mistakes should be examined, learned from, then maybe discarded and not dwelled upon. But generally, feedback should be thought of as something positive and a learning curve, and it is. But I have a feeling that for many people, feedback does have negative connotations. Yeah, that a lot of people think that feedback is something like criticism or even an attack. And in fact, there are some studies that show that when you have a group of students and you divide them into two, and you talk with one group about the positive sides of their performance or their learning, and then you talk to the other group about the negative sides with that kind of expectation that it would allow them to improve. What happens is that the sympathetic nervous system lights up, so the fight or flight system lights up in those students where the focus is on the negatives, or the focus is on the improvement rather than the focus is on the strengths. So actually, it's almost like in order for us to improve, we need to be talking about the strengths and the positives and not really talk about the negatives. But obviously, when we give feedback or receive feedback, we want to learn from it. So we need to know about the negative elements of our performance. So how do we balance it? Or, how do you react to negative responses?
Oh, I mean, like, I hate that. So yeah, like everyone, it's not fun, is it, when you get sort of feedback that suggests or negative responses to something that you've done, particularly if you've put a lot of work into something or you think it deserves a fairer perspective or a fairer judgment.
But I wonder, do you feel that it depends on how it's delivered? Because obviously we want to hear, I want to know what went wrong. Yeah. And obviously if something went wrong, and we are hopelessly wrong all the time about a lot of things, yeah, and we make mistakes constantly. And so I want to know what went wrong with what I did, for example. But how do I get it in a way that it doesn't feel bad or it doesn't feel personal?
Well, I think that's something that I've been very conscious of before, in terms when I've marked work. I've thought about my response in terms of negative feedback, and then I've thought, well, how are the sort of my students going to respond to or what I say, and how can I communicate this in a way that sort of suggests or points out to them that they've done some really good stuff here, or but that they might need to develop particular aspects. And I think it can be really. I think you really need to make sure you've got that balance right, because you don't want to destroy someone's confidence when they've submitted something. you want to build them up, and you want to show them how you show them that it's possible as well, that these are all things that are in their wheelhouse that they can do. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. But I think it's very hard. It's so hard, especially, I mean, because feedback is contextual, right? So actually you never give the same kind of feedback, and feedback will depend on the context of the situation, on the context of the person. So the more you know the person, the better or easier it is maybe to even give them that feedback, which I don't know how you felt about, for example, so you mentioned marking. I felt that anonymizing students' essays made it really difficult to give the kind of feedback I felt the student needed. So I've had these conversations with students who told me, don't be so nice to me. I want to hear the bad stuff, yeah, because they don't need that praise, yeah. They don't need it,
yeah.
Or maybe they have very high standards, and therefore they just want to hear what exactly they did wrong and how they can improve it. But then there are students who say, you're so negative, and I'm losing motivation if I hear all this negative feedback. So knowing who you're giving feedback to can allow you to deliver it in a way that will be taken, in the most constructive way.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, and it's why when I was sort of in that marking role, I thought it was always really important to offer sort of a tutorial after the fact, so that you could then discuss with that student, or go into a little bit more detail and give that sort of personal side to the feedback. I also think it's interesting because sometimes you might be thinking that you're giving some really clear or detailed comments back, but sometimes it can be overwhelming if you give too much feedback as well. I know I have had students who are like, this is a lot on the page, and I've sort of been like, oh, maybe I should have dialed it back down again. In some ways I was trying to help, but it may have actually caused more anxiety. Does that make sense?
Totally. And this is why I think we, in learning development, if we can, we do not give written feedback. Also because if you really want to go into depth and have a good conversation about a piece of writing, you would have to write a lot, but also a lot gets kind of lost in translation when you write about it. And you cannot necessarily go into the same kind of vivid detail about someone's performance. And I mean, both on the positive and negative way. And negative, the word itself is negative, but I mean in a more kind of the kind of feedback that is geared towards improvement, yeah. Which is why I feel like having a conversation is always much more productive, and you can really get into the nitty-gritty and also regulate, because you can see when you're speaking to someone, yeah, you can see how they're taking it. And anyone with a little bit of emotional intelligence will be able to tell when it's time.
Well, that's the issue. So, you do have to have that. So.
And it even if you don't, I think sometimes when people are aware that they don't necessarily have that emotional intelligence, maybe sticking to certain rules, like balance it out, do 2-3 positive things, do 2-3 negative things, and then you don't have to worry about it as much, that you're not reading the other person. But I still feel that in a conversation it's so much easier to deliver that feedback, even though it takes courage as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think I like the idea of sort of having certain rules. I know I've definitely tried to do the sort of praise sandwich approach before, where you start and end with something positive, and that you may be more sort of talking about what you can improve in the sort of middle parts. Now, I suppose you just got to be careful that you're not, again, that sort of filling bit isn't too large. and that you're not being too overwhelmed, you're not overwhelming people with that.
Yeah, but I think it goes both ways. So I think the sandwiching technique is good and important because you need to be in balance. Yeah, you need to, the positives have to be as vivid and detailed as the negatives, and you have to go as deep as possible. But I think sometimes what happens with the sandwich is that the criticism, which is necessary for the improvement of someone's performance, gets kind of almost drowned in the, so let's say
in the positive.
Yeah, you say, oh, this is a really good essay. You did all these fantastic things. Now, the problem is this, and that, but actually it's a great essay. And, if I receive something like this, all I will remember is, oh, a great essay. Fine, I don't have to worry about anything. So knowing how to deliver it in a way that will be, okay, you did all these things great, but then now let me, on the other hand, point out what could be improved, and giving as much attention to both sides as possible.
Yeah. I think that also is the important point, because a lot of students that they obviously they want to know how they've done with a particular piece of work, but they also want to know how they can improve. That's the aspect that sometimes is missing in feedback, or isn't there enough. And I think that is something to be really aware of, that students want.
Yeah, certainly. And it's an art, and it takes time, doesn't it? I still feel like I'm really not an expert on giving feedback. I try, and I feel like it's developed over the years, but whenever I give really good feedback, I feel really proud of myself. Like, wow, that will really build someone up. That will really help them. And sometimes I look at my feedback and think, oh my gosh, I got carried away with this or that, because it's just so easy to do, especially if you're rushing, or you have a pile of papers to mark, etc. So it takes really a lot of effort and attention and intention as well, that positive intention, to help. Because what is really the essence of feedback? We get given feedback when someone wants our behavior to change.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's no other reason. Someone wants something from us, which is why feedback is often unwanted. So if you're doing something and someone approaches you and says, let me give you some feedback. And you're like, and you are who?
Yeah, exactly. I'm not sure I'd like that. That's not my favorite bit of feedback. I wouldn't like that kind of feedback.
But feedback is there all the time. I feel like, it's not something, it's something necessarily we intentionally give or receive. It's often just given. Every time we speak or listen to another person, we choose certain words or tone or silences in that conversation. We also communicate feedback to them on how it is to have a conversation with them. Yeah. Also,
no, what
I mean,
saying?
You just nodded. You just gave me feedback, in fact.
Well, no, but I think we sometimes forget, don't we, that that feedback is taking place all the time during our degree, and it's not just at the end. It's not just the end point, is it? It's not just the here's your mark kind of thing. You'll have had feedback during your seminars, in response to points you've made, or in debates you've had, or conversations. And I think that's can often be just as important sometimes, in terms of like getting you to think about how you might approach a particular assignment, or what you need to include, and things like that.
And it kind of allows us to constantly calibrate, right, our own behavior and calibrate our performance, because and even if let's say you mentioned being in seminars and how people respond to what you say, I think, well, that's actually really, really difficult now, isn't it? Because when you are faced with black screens, or you actually don't know if people are looking at you, they're looking at something in front of them, but you don't know if they're looking at you, if they're reacting to what you're doing or to something else. So that feedback loop is disrupted massively at the moment.
I think what I miss the most is being able to, I mean, breakout rooms are great. I like them, but I miss that sort of being able to survey the different conversations and debates that were taking place around in a seminar, so that you could drop in, but you also knew how the discussion had formed or where it was maybe going, so that you could have a clearer idea of then, what feedback you could give or what comments you could give. And I think that, you miss out on that a little bit in the online environment. One thing I wanted to ask you was, because I read something that actually some students don't read their feedback, like on assignments. And what do you think of that?
That always breaks my heart. And for so many reasons. And one reason is purely selfish, because I feel like, when I give feedback, I spend a lot of time and effort on it. And the thought that someone doesn't read it seems like such a waste. So this is the kind of more selfish reason, but also because every feedback is an opportunity. Or should be, at least. I'm saying should be because ideally we would like feedback to be an opportunity. But this actually takes me to that issue of, is feedback always useful? Do you feel that there could be, or have you ever received feedback which actually undermined you rather than helped you with something?
I'm sure I have. I can't think of a specific instance, but I'm sure I have. Perhaps, maybe not in terms of like an assessment, but in terms of maybe, like if someone gave me feedback on how I performed or what I did or something, maybe that's happened. And I suppose sometimes it can stop you a little bit, it can make you feel, it can make you lose confidence in yourself, perhaps, or and you don't want feedback to be doing that, do you? It should be propelling you or helping you to improve, not stopping you in your tracks, basically.
I think that sometimes feedback can be more distortion than truth, because how we evaluate things, behaviors, people, it really is very deeply colored by our own understanding of what excellence is or what is good in that particular behavior, right? So we have a sense, everyone has a sense of what good looks like in a particular area. And we also have certain tendency towards being harsh or lenient, or we have our unconscious biases as well. And then the feedback may be a reflection of these more than a reflection of someone's performance. So actually, when we give feedback, we give someone our version of what happened.
I mean, there's a whole issue, isn't there, in student evaluations where women, for instance, or people from other minorities might be evaluated at more harshly or more critically than white men as well. So and I think that's important, and that's often, as you said, about unconscious bias.
So we don't even realize that we're doing it, but we will mark that person down based on these characteristics, or accent. But all these issues matter. So in fact, the feedback is often a reflection of our own characteristics and not the characteristics of the other person, which is why the object for today,
I don't know what this is going to be.
It's a mirror.
Oh, wow. I like a mirror as well.
You just saw a million of my post-its. But I brought a mirror because I feel that feedback is like a mirror. on so many, I mean, it's a bit of a cliche, obviously, because we are reflecting what we see in that feedback, right? We are reflecting that person to themselves. We're pointing the mirror at them, but actually at the same time, we're pointing it at us, at ourselves as well, because
I like that.
Because it reflects us, what's important to us, what we consider good or not good, and what we consider worthy of someone else's attention.
Yeah.
Yeah, because you'll get feedback. I mean, we get our sessions in LD, for example, assessed all the time. And have you ever had a range where, there will be like, this was brilliant, great, great, great. And then someone says, it was awful. And you're like, but why?
Very unlikely to improve my work.
and that's, I love this one, because we ask this question of students, right? How do you think that this session will have an impact on your skills or on your grades? And some students will say yes, and some will say not at all. And is it because the session objectively won't have that impact, or is it a reflection of how the student thinks or believes in their ability to improve, for example, their grade?
That's interesting. Because it's a very much a judgment on they're almost self-assessing themselves, aren't they? In that judgment, which I think is really interesting. I think it also, for me, it brings me to the point where obviously feedback is really important, but throughout your degree, part of what you need to be building up is almost that sort of that you're giving yourself the feedback, or you're self-assessing how you're doing and how you can improve and what you can improve.
Which is also dangerous, isn't it? Because again, some people are their worst, harshest critics. Right? And when you constantly give yourself this kind of feedback, you're actually not going anywhere with this, but you're
I suppose if you're just saying I'm doing amazing, it's fine.
Well, so actually it always has to be that interplay, right, of the external feedback and your own, and your own kind of self-grounding as well, knowing, well, that kind of feedback is not useful to me, and I'm going to not dwell upon it, because it's also easy to have, let's say you have 100 responses to your performance, and 98 will be very positive, but you get 2 negative, and you'll just hold on to these 2 negative because they just crush you, right? So that's completely out of balance. But most people do it because they have such high standards that these 2 will crush them more than the 98 will build them up. But it's also how it's delivered, isn't it? Because if it's not very constructive, that's what we do, because we have nothing to build on. And by constructive, I mean just really kind of details in terms of how that person saw it. So let's say, if you say something, this is how it came across to me, or this is what it made me think about. I love this kind of feedback, because I know it's coming from that person. It's
really individualized, isn't it?
Yeah, but I also know that that person is not trying to give me some objective, but also not pretending that they're coming from any kind of objective version of reality or excellence. And this is what it should or shouldn't be, but more is how it chimed with them, how it resonated with their understanding of the world, and maybe what it changed about it. And I think if you do it this way, that it's not the truth, but it's your truth, as someone who's looking at it and assessing it. I think what's happening is you're giving someone an insight, and by giving them that insight into how you feel about it, you're kind of highlighting some sort of a pattern of behavior that's already there, so they can recognize it and they can refine it. And that's a good kind of learning curve, because I know, okay, I have it in me, I can build on it to make things better, rather than obsess about stuff
Or
that doesn't
consider
matter.
their perspective, I suppose, and consider their perspective and see how you could, how it might add to or augment what you already have, I suppose. Or
Yeah, yeah. But
no,
it doesn't mean necessarily praising people, right? Because praise can be also, I mean, praise can feel nice, but I think it can also feel not very genuine. But it can
okay.
feel like someone is just giving it to you because it's easier for them than that kind of courageous act of of being
I'm not sure.
constructively
I still
critical.
like praise. Give me all the praise. But I know what you mean. It might not necessarily help you rethink something that
Yeah,
that might just, and it may just sort of reinforce something that that could be explored from a different perspective or
yeah,
a different
yeah,
angle. So
yeah. So in a way, I think good feedback is the kind of feedback which allows us to recognize what we're doing well and where our strengths are, but at the same time, be able to see how others see us and just be aware of it, aware of that. Because I think once we're aware of something, we can choose to respond to it by acting on it and doing something about it, or decide that actually this isn't something I can do much about. So let's
yeah,
say if someone gave me feedback, oh, you know what, your accent is not quite helping me understand you. Yeah, so I can choose to say,
like
I can choose to say, well, nothing I can do about it. This is what it is. You get what you get. Or I can do something about it. Maybe I can't change my accent, but I can start speaking more slowly, or I can be more careful in how I choose my words, so stuff like
or you
that.
can have that person never be in your session.
Yeah, so there's a range of responses basically. And I think it's important to be aware of that we do have control over it, and it's in
Yeah.
the end it's our decision what we do with that feedback.
And I suppose that's why then, in response to people that don't tend to look at their feedback, is that what you would say to them, that this is some, how would you push them to then look at it?
Yeah. And this is important to know in terms of how to give feedback. So there are certain don'ts, right? I mean, like, one of the classics is not to make it personal.
Yeah.
Even using the word you did this, you you didn't do that. It's enough to create that sense of a personal attack that may lead us to shutting down and becoming defensive because it feels personal. So it should never feel personal. Do you have any other kind of don'ts that you feel like, oh, never do it this way?
Well, I think you want to avoid really sort of vague comments or statements. I think I've seen. I understand. Obviously, lecturers have a lot of marking to do, but you want to avoid that kind of thing where you put like sense against a particular passage, or just like a 1 word or 2 word comment that I think could just be explained more effectively.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps. What do you think?
Yeah, I know there's a classic. Your analysis could be stronger. And we're like, okay, what does it mean? Yeah. So yeah, so it's pretty generic. It's pretty vague.
Yeah.
But I suppose so. If we're talking about written feedback, we often have that ability to provide detailed feedback and comments throughout the work, and then more general feedback. So it's important to look at both and be able to see examples, let's say, within the work. But obviously, everyone does it differently. But even if we're talking, let's say, about a presentation or conversation or a performance in a seminar, then too you would not want to be too vague and too generic about it, but
Definitely.
just provide examples maybe of what was really good and where things could be done maybe slightly better?
I think that providing examples is a really good way of showing what you're trying to say, isn't it?
Yeah.
Making it concrete.
Yeah. So it's that, I think maybe in addition, so you mentioned not being too generic or general, but then also not to be too detailed, because that can.
Well, I suppose, yeah. I'm just thinking now of sometimes when my comments have become almost essay like in there. That I've written so many words, probably more than the essay itself that I'm marking. I think, and I think that can just be a bit problematic because it can overwhelm you, and it can maybe obscure what you're trying to say. You need to sort of, boil it down, don't you? Feedback needs to boil down the sort of the actual specific points that you're trying to comment on, and if you provide so much detail, then it might actually take away from that clarity of these are the three main points that I think you could improve.
Yeah. And this is in fact a good advice, not just for teachers, tutors, lecturers who provide feedback, but also students who provide feedback for other students, right? If they have to do that, it would also be good for them to be able to kind of distill it to these main points, like you mentioned, pick 3 points that you can find in someone's work or performance to point out, to elaborate, and show how they resonated with you.
And obviously prioritize the 3 most important, not just the 3 that's most easy to spot, perhaps. I think that's also important too.
Which means it requires effort again. Actually providing feedback is an exercise.
Oh, it's a huge amount of effort, I think, and it can be quite tiring and draining. And lecturers are often expected to do it in a short amount of time, which is never realistic. So so I feel for them hugely.
But then coming back to students who provide feedback to other students, I think what often happens also is that there's that fear to be critical, right? Because you don't want to criticize your friends because you don't feel maybe equipped to do so. You don't feel like you're any authority, and I think that's a good feeling. It's good to keep it in mind that you're both learning, right? Still learning, and you're only offering your perspective and your thoughts. So that person has the right to make their own decisions regarding what to implement, what not to implement. But I think it's important not to kind of position yourself as an expert when you do that.
I think that's true. And I think it's about that language that you were talking about earlier, where you were saying, making it very clear that it, from your perspective, or, because it's suggesting this is a view, it's an or an alternative perspective, alternative view. It's not the one from authority, perhaps.
And even if there are certain areas of authority, let's say someone's referencing is not quite right, so instead of saying you did your referencing wrong, right, you can say, well, if you compare your referencing to Harvard, let's say there are certain inconsistencies there, and you can point out to Harvard as being the
as long as you don't sound too passive aggressive when you say it.
No, exactly. And we're coming back again to how it's said. But I think that fear to hurt someone's feelings when we give feedback is also important, because if we do have that fear, we may avoid indicating any problems whatsoever. We will only give the kind of feedback that will praise or will be overly positive. And that person not only will not learn anything from it, but also will feel like, oh, that's not genuine. You're just being nice.
I think it's interesting though, because whenever I think students, whenever I've sort of given peer reviewing exercises for students to do, they often do a fantastic job of
Mm.
critiquing, but I think it's because the person whose work is being looked at, they're part of the discussion as well. So that can really work effectively, I think, as if people remember some of those sort of important points about not worry, well, not critiquing head on, but not also worrying about criticizing your friends or things like that. So
I think that students are really good at being empathetic, right? Because it's about empathy. It's about knowing what kind of feedback would you want to receive and how would you want to have it delivered. And if you know that, then you can do it to your friend, for your friend as well. Yeah. And to be honest, I think to some people it's easier maybe even to give feedback to a friend than to themselves, because we tend to be so harsh on ourselves. We tend to say things to ourselves we would never say to our friend. Oh, you are so rubbish. I can say that to myself, but I will never say it to my friend. And so that kind of empathy is
this reminds me of all the times that I've sort of shouted at my computer screen about how terrible a piece of work is or something. With my partner being like, it's absolutely fine. It's so, but yeah.
But you know what you just said is also important, that you were shouting about how terrible that piece of work is and not you are. Yeah. And that's an important element of giving.
Oh, well, I will remember this in future.
No, because when you give feedback, you should always focus on the work and not
at least
the
I'm
person.
not personalizing it. That's true. When I'm shouting at the computer, I'm not saying you're the. Yeah, exactly. That's good.
Yeah, so that's good. So yeah, and I suppose we probably don't even have to mention being respectful and constructive. That's kind of a given of any feedback, isn't it? You're not rubbish, Matthew.
Thank you. Oh, that felt good.
And I think, so what you said at the very beginning, when you said, I love receiving feedback, is it because you look at it as a sort of gift?
I'm not sure.
Not that much. You wouldn't go that far.
Maybe not that far, no. I think it's just I think it's because often you put a lot of effort or work into assessments or pieces of work or things like that. And for me, it was always interesting to see what other people thought of like sort of what I had done, because you never really know, do you? You never know to what extent your thoughts or ideas about something might match up with others. So, but I do like the idea of a gift. I mean, I suppose this whole conversation has made me think about feedback in a bit of a new light. And sort of my own sort of expectations of it, and also how I might give feedback to others. What about you? Do you think
this changed you? That's
amazing. Although I still think I still love feedback. It's not
no, that's good, because I think we should love it, but we should love it in a very aware way in terms of what it can give us, and not look at it as something that is objective, that's something that is the truth of the situation, but something that comes from a very subjective place, and that is useful. It doesn't mean that it's not useful. That is useful, but it's not thinking. Because I think it's so easy to get damaged by feedback. I know lots of people do, and lots of people cringe when they hear, I'll give you some feedback. And you're like, tense up and start hearing it.
And in academia, the whole sort of second reviewer is,
yes, indeed,
legendary, isn't it? So
second reviewers are legendary for sure. But at the same time, we do know from all sorts of research that feedback is very important, that academic feedback is more strongly related to achievement than any other teaching behavior. So actually feedback is more effective than giving a lecture or even having a seminar. Yeah, but obviously this feedback has to be acted on, it has to be read and understood.
Yeah.
And something has to be done about it. Feedback in and of itself doesn't solve problems, right?
I think if anybody watching this who doesn't tend to read their feedback, and I know why sometimes people do, it's because they feel I've done with that now, I want to move on to the next thing. But I suppose the whole point of feedback is that you are moving on to the next thing, but with these thoughts or aims in mind for the next thing. So
Yeah.
So yeah, I definitely recommend don't ignore feedback.
Yeah. And I think maybe, so don't ignore feedback, but also don't miss opportunities to try to give it as well, and try to use it as an opportunity to learn from it, because I think that giving feedback is not just for the benefit of the recipient, but also for our own benefit, because we learn from it. Yeah. So when we give feedback, might be a good idea to ask for feedback on our feedback. Yeah, so we can improve that skill as well. But basically, approaching feedback in the spirit of learning, it can also help minimize any anxiety we might feel about the process itself.
I feel like I think we should return to feedback again some day in the future. I feel like there's more that can be said. Does that make sense?
It does, because feedback definitely allows us to keep learning.
And on that note.
Indeed. Yes, thank you. Thanks for this conversation. I enjoyed it as well. So thank you for watching, and feel free to subscribe to the podcast and comment, ask questions, and give us feedback.
On smooth.
Until next time.
Keep learning.
Bye.